Okay.
Oh man. Anyway, I'm here with Lance. We're going to talk for a while about preamps, just because we want to, and it might be of interest.
This is a new preamp. The one we started with sounded fantastic.
Yeah, it did.
Right? Sounded good. And everything was fine, but the camera was giving us some trouble. And that's because of the kind of power supply that that particular design relied on. I've redesigned this and made a discrete circuit, meaning that instead of everything being, or most of it being in an integrated circuit or a microchip, I'm using separate individual transistors and components to create a preamplifier circuit.
Yeah.
And because of the way this is designed, it will run off of what's called a single polarity supply, where you just have plus and minus, which is what the battery provides. The one before this was using that power from the battery, but I was turning it into a plus, minus, and zero, or balanced supply. So that preamplifier, the first one, sounds great. But now I'm starting fresh with a new design, and this sounds incredible.
The previous preamp came from a balanced power supply, so it had a positive, a negative, and I guess you would call it
And
a
a
neutral
ground.
or a ground.
Yeah, in the middle.
And this one doesn't need it. It's on one side. I thought we should talk about this because there was a guy on the Kickstarter that helped fund us that wanted to try to, I guess, pad the output.
Oh yeah.
And one of the reasons why he needed to pad the output was because some of these recorders don't have line ends and they don't have pads anymore. You know, what was it the other day? I told you about that, and you thought it was really funny because it's totally obvious that no matter if you turn the volume all the way down, it's still feeding negative.
Yeah.
You know, 1 plus negative 1 equals 0 back in. So
There's a
you're
portion
still,
of that circuit that's always receiving that full level, that full input signal. Yeah.
So it's overloadable. If you have like the volume pot or the trim pot, I don't know what you would call it because we only got one.
Well, actually, I'll point something out. There's a difference between a volume control and gain control when you're talking about like design. A gain control actually varies the amount of electrical gain. So electrical being the audio signal is a small electrical signal, right? So the gain control controls or varies the amount of increase that your electronics create from that small input signal. But a volume control varies the amount of signal coming into that section of the circuit, kind of. And you might think they're the same thing, but they're not. This design that I'm working on now actually has a volume control at the front end, and the gain of my preamp is fixed. So if it's too loud and you turn it down, the preamplifier is not going to get overloaded.
So there's no penalty then, because it doesn't change the noise floor. So in other words, if you turn the volume up or down until it's the right size, you always have the perfect amount of gain.
Yeah. The noise
because
floor,
it's the correct size, because the gain's never changing afterwards on the amplifier.
Yeah, the output of this is at a fixed level, technically speaking, where noise floor is concerned, because again, you're not changing the electrical gain of the actual preamp.
Yeah.
You're changing how much signal you're feeding into it.
That means there's really no way to screw up. If you turn the knob until it's in the right place and it sounds right, you're getting perfect optimal performance.
Yeah, pretty
regardless.
much.
We should talk about simplicity. I mean, because that's kind of, there's this really weird thing going on, and then I wanted to ask you a little bit about the place for discrete amplifiers. I mean, there are no parts there. It's like a really simple machine, but you only see discrete amplifiers in really expensive home stereo, like recording studio equipment.
This started out being a basic application circuit, and since I started with that, I've added to it and changed several things about it. So it's not so plug and play. When you have a basic op amp design, they can just stamp that right in, and the components are inexpensive, it's easy, and it does get the job done effectively, but it's not necessarily going to have so much character. I'm not really sure why people don't use this kind of technology more often.
Surface mount?
Surface mount makes it real easy. And the smaller those components get, the more, even when they sound good, an integrated circuit compared to something like this tends to be a little bit more sterile.
Well, I mean, the other thing though is that these are fine, kind of acute differences. You know, you're not talking about frequency response or slew rate. Like the bottom end of acceptable in this world is high performance. Right? So it doesn't so that the term character is more of like, like from critical listening, which is kind of out of the scope of our product anyway. Like the Lunchbox is for getting audio in the field,
Right.
which is not an ideal. You don't shoot in an anechoic chamber.
No.
Like there is no good condition for shooting. So this is kind of a luxury, isn't it? Or
Well, it is. You're actually getting a lot for, there are a couple points I want to raise. One, as far as being in the field and not being in a perfect acoustic environment or situation, the best recordings going back, pick up an old Etta James record, put it on a good turntable and listen to it. And then if you go and learn how they recorded those albums, it will blow your mind how simple it was and how they set those rooms up to capture a balance of everything being done in the room. And she was right in front and everything kind of spaced out behind her based on where it needed to be in the mix. A lot of those recordings were done with one microphone. And so that's some of the earliest ones. And even a band like Led Zeppelin, John Bonham, the drummer, would not let anybody put microphones close to his drum kit in the studio. He wanted distance miking because he wanted to capture the sound of the kit. So this, to get to the point, the Loggers Lunchbox actually kind of follows that philosophy of capturing the sound with the greatest quality that you can and not trying to perfect the environment. That allows you to go into any environment and get exceptional audio. Instead of saying, well, we have to build this session around the limitations of our equipment. We don't want any crosstalk. We don't want any noise. We don't want it to sound human. Well, what if you're interviewing someone and the person's talking and it just has a very warm, crisp, nice sound to it? That does add something exciting to the production. And you won't get that with something that can't produce it. So I think when people, I love what I do, so I get irritated when I hear somebody kind of devalue it by saying, oh, they won't know the difference. Well, if they won't know the difference, then why isn't Tony serving $50 steaks on paper plates? It's all about presenting things a certain way, and it's very important. So I think this provides what we're working so hard for here is not just to stuff something in the box to make it work and get it out there, but to put something in there that actually does something exceptional. I'm trying to evaluate how this thing performs. One of the things that I'm doing is running a test tone through it, and that's part of that is because I'm looking for what's called a DC offset. This line runs right through the middle of the screen here, and so that is technically 0. And I'll fake it here so you can understand what I'm saying, but if there was an offset, like a positive DC offset, so if the signal coming through our preamp was being distorted by a power supply issue, it would move, it would show up, but the line would be above 0. Or if it was a negative offset, it would go below 0. As I turn the gain up, you see that the sine wave that represents that actual frequency, this 1,000 cycle tone, it's sitting right between these two lines. So 0 runs right through the middle of that. And that means that this is a perfect position. This is what you want to see when you run something through this preamp. This can produce up to 3.43 volts. Capacity is not an issue. It can produce lots of output. And that's good because you'll never get it to here. You'll never get it to ugly. That means it can go way past its usable range and still not freak out. And that means it really has a lot of what we'd call headroom. I think the concern is more or less what that thing sounds like. What is the personality of it when you listen to it? And there are all these, kind of like describing food and flavors and smells and things like that. There are all these different ways of looking at it. You're not so concerned about what kind of spatula the chef used, what kind of tongs the chef used. You're more looking for the end result and what the flavor and what the presentation is. And so you would assume if you're paying $3,500 for a mic preamp to put in your studio that it probably isn't horrible. And if you get a $3,500 preamp and it's horrible, you'll definitely be shipping it back and telling them what you think of that. And you go, hey, what is this garbage? So it's just a known that this thing's going to perform within a reasonable range. This kind of a circuit has that sort of boutique appeal to it, I think, because it is always going to be handmade, or at least for a very long time. I don't know where this will wind up going, but this circuitry is something, this preamplifier is something that could be compared to some of those much more expensive and more involved devices, based on the fact that it has its own distinct personality. So if we run a pink noise source, which sounds like this, it kind of sounds like a radio or a television that's not tuned in. We run that through this preamp and then bring it back to this analyzer, we can see that the original source looks like this. It's very kind of flat across there.
Right.
Then if we go to our preamp, we see that there's a little bit, a couple decibels of presence peak there, and then there's a bit of a roll off here in the low frequency range, which is exactly what we wanted. That's what we wanted from the other one too, and that's what I managed to get by filtering the output so that you didn't have low frequency rumble and problems like that.
Someone's going to ask about the difference between subsonic garbage and bass, and we were talking about recording live music kick drums, and
right, a bass drum in a drum set, we'd see it centering, meaning it's the middle of its energy, the most of its energy. It's usually somewhere around 80 hertz or 80 cycles a second. Well, 80 is right about here. And I don't know if you can see these divisions, but that 80 is right about at the end of this third division. Well, that's really where the meat and potatoes of that sound exists, and you don't need to go that much below that to feel the energy of that instrument and for something to sound nice. A human voice doesn't really need to come out much below 150 cycles for it to sound nice and full.
When people tailor the low frequency response of the amplifier, people think that there's 20 cycle information that's important, and they don't realize that if you have it exactly what you actually want to get a full, bass guitar, kick drum, and have a really solid meaty sound, that the filter won't look like what people think it is.
No.
It'll be basically that.
Well, as you can see here, and of course this may not make sense to the people who are watching it, but just to illustrate, what we're seeing here is that there's about a minus 10 dB point at 50 cycles, which is kind of where we wanted it. So this is gradually rolling off, and that means that a gradual roll off is something that's nice. This is gradual enough that this thing doesn't sound thin. It doesn't sound papery and flimsy. It sounds nice and full when you run a microphone through it or music or anything, but we're kind of getting rid of problems down here, but that energy's still there. You can see it. And there's a little tilt up here, which is characteristic of these transistors, and it actually sounds really nice. It sounds nice and clear. And interestingly enough, just about any time, this follows suit with what would be called the Fletcher-Munson curve, right?
Right, yeah.
This is a natural occurrence of that, and in the low frequency range it's tilted out, and you'd think, well, wouldn't you want to see that increase there again in the low frequency range? But you don't. The energy in low frequency is different. So there's less of it here electrically, and there's a little more of this here to clarify everything up on top. But when you listen to something natural through it, like a voice, again, or an instrument or something like that, this makes sense. There's plenty of this here.
It's awesome. Because it is decision making. It's not just, we want to make this thing turn on and behave a certain way. It's beyond that, into making something that really gives you what you need. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about it. It's more serious than just, is everything there?
When you plug it in and you listen to it, when you plug it in and you plug things into it, you use it, when you get into post-production and you hear your audio, that's the end result. That's the picture of the final result. I'm talking about how we got you there, if that makes any sense. That's kind of what this is. This is the pilot part of getting you from point A to point B and hopefully landing safely.
Can we run some signals through it? Is that possible?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, awesome.